Morning, I'd like to invite you to join me once again in the book of Esther. And just like last week, if you don't know where the book of Esther is, you can open up your Bible to the middle, to the book of Psalms, and then begin turning to the left. And the first book you will come across is the book of Job, and then the second book should be the book of Esther. If it's not, you might need a new Bible. We'll be reading here in just a moment from Esther chapter 4. Last week, as we continued on with our series of lessons about God and work, or what we're often calling a theology of work, we began to explore the darker side of this particular subject. These lessons began about 3 weeks ago, of course, by looking at the fact that work is a good thing, and that is a necessary part of God's creation. It gives us a sense of meaning and a sense of dignity in life. But last week we also made note of the fact that in a fallen world, even though it is true that work is a very good and wonderful thing, something that God has intended for us as a part of His creation, it's also true that everything has been affected by the curse. And work certainly is no exception to that. And therefore, there is a darker side to this element of work. Last week, we focused on the idea of how work can oftentimes be fruitless or even meaningless. We all face resistance in our work. We all have difficulties, whether it's with other people or whether it's just with the job that we're doing. In the worst of cases, work can even be oppressive, as in the case of hard labor and slaves and those sorts of things. However, even in the most productive of people, and those who do the best kind of work, even in those kinds of situations, when there's very little resistance to be met, still it can seem like work has a sense of meaninglessness to it, that there's a sense of vanity to it. And so this week I want to continue on with our exploration of the darker side of work, but I actually want to now look at the opposite error. Rather than seeing work as meaningless or as something vain, this time I want to flip it over and I want to look at the other side. I want to examine what happens when we try to give work too much credibility, when we try to give work too much meaning in our life. And in order to illustrate this for you this morning, I want to take you back very briefly in your minds to a story that I had read for us earlier in our scripture reading. Like several of the texts that we have looked at over the last several weeks, this story harkens back to the beginning days of the world, especially to the beginning days of your Bible. It is, of course, the story of the Tower of Babel. And if you recall in that story, you might remember that this is the first major story that is told after the recreation of the world. Now, I had never known that this is where West Texas got distinguished from the Yankees, but hey, I learned something this morning in learning about that. But you also will remember about the story that you had there in the days of Noah, that God was going to destroy the world because of the sin that was rampant there in the earth. He was going to begin again, this time with a new Adam and Eve, which ended up being Noah and his wife and all of his family. However, as things begin again, unfortunately, they do not start out on a very good note. Once again, God tells the people to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill up the earth. But in the story of the Tower of Babel, we see what happens. The people on the earth are intending to disobey God. And two sins primarily come out of the story of the Tower of Babel. One is the people want to make a name for themselves. They've developed this new technology called bricks, and this is much better than stone, and they've figured out now they can build these great big towers and these sorts of things. So they're going to build a tower up to heaven so they can exert themselves in their work. They are going to make a name for themselves as they fulfill their working powers. But then there is also a second sin that is involved, and that is they were trying to avoid God's command to spread out over the earth. Instead, they all wanted to gather together in one place for protection, we assume, in order that they might build a community, and through that community they might together assert their power. Interestingly enough, we see in both of those sins the impulse that has become the scourge of the economic world for the last 100 years. And that is the fundamental attempt to make work the sum of the identity of man. Now, this can either happen in an individualistic sense by those who want to make a name for themselves, or it can happen in the community by those who want to make a name for the community, to make the commune ultimate. And taken at their extremes, we can see in this story both the roots of communism and a very crass form of capitalism, can't we? Now, I doubt, of course, that that's what the author of Genesis had in mind whenever he was writing that story, but nonetheless, as Solomon told us in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. There, at the beginning of the rebirth of man, was the same temptations that still plague us today. And it's those temptations that I want to focus in on this morning, the temptation to make our work a form of idolatry. What is idolatry? Well, it is the taking of any one thing, often a good and wonderful thing, and making it the ultimate thing. And that temptation can happen with things like sex and money and power and all those marquee things that we normally think about, but can also happen with things like our work. And so what we are talking about here this morning is the fundamental tension that we have inside of all of us. And that is the need to serve ourselves as individuals, and also the need that we have to serve the greater community or the greater good. How do we balance that correctly? This morning, I would like to take you to a different Old Testament story from the story of the Tower of Babel. And I hope maybe this will help us to consider this question more carefully. So if you have your Bibles open, I would like for you to join me in Esther chapter 4. I gave David the hard reading in chapter 2 earlier, and I'm glad he's cleared that out of the way for me. But in chapter 2, you have the beginning of the story of Esther. Esther ascends from being a poor peasant girl, and she comes to the throne along with King Xerxes. But we find out something happens in chapter 3 that is very disturbing. Esther has a father figure. It's her cousin, actually, but he ends up being her adopted father, Mordecai. And he ends up making angry one of the king's officials named Haman. And Haman's so furious that Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. He's decided he's going to kill Mordecai, but not only is he going to kill Mordecai, he's going to kill all of the Jews. And here is Esther, who is very quiet about her Jewishness, in the king's palace. What is she going to do about this? Let's read as the story comes to its climax in Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city wailing and loudly and bitterly. But whenever he was only as far as the king's gate, but he went only so far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was great mourning along with the Jews, and there was fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and the eunuchs told her of what Mordecai was doing, she was in great distress. And she sent clothes for him to put on him instead of his sackcloth, but he refused to accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend to her, and he ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to find Mordecai in the open square of the city and in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jewish people. He also gave a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which has been placed in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and to plead him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said, and then she instructed him to go back and to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without having been first summoned, has but one law for them. The king has but one law for them, that they be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I have been called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer to her: "Do not think that you are in the king's house, and that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, I will do this. And if I perish, then I perish." So Mordecai went away, and he carried out all of Esther's instructions. At the end of this year, I will be marking somewhat of a unique anniversary in my life. This is not the normal kind of thing that a person notes as an anniversary, but for me, in my young life, it is something that I have taken note of and bears some importance to me. This December, if God willing, I am able to live that long, and I have you know that I fully intend to with God's blessings, I will celebrate the fact that I have now been out of the bank longer than I actually worked in the bank. Now, in many ways, that sounds like sort of a strange thing to remember as an anniversary, but for me, for various reasons, it's something meaningful to me because I spent a lot of my years there. For those of you who have been with me since the beginning of my time preaching here, you know that the bank was a very good and a very important job for me. After having gone to Sunset for 2 years and not having to work during those 2 years because I was on missionary support, well, the bank was the way that I paid my way through school, paid my way through college. I got married while I worked at the bank. I finished college and graduate school while I worked there. I paid off the majority of my student loans while I was working both there and here. And those years, those nearly 7 years, represent for me a very formative and a very meaningful time in my life. There were a number of things that I really loved about working at the bank, including the friends that I made and the experiences that I had there. But one of the things that I loved most, particularly about working at the bank, was the system of bonuses that they had at the time. Now, we've all heard about big banks and their great big bonuses for their top executives, but for the bank where I worked at, it was really neat because they spread their bonuses the same percentage out to everyone in the company. And of course, this was in the heyday of banking. This was before 2008, before the big crash, so things have changed a little bit over in the years. But this was back in the good days when you could make, like 5% on just a checking account. Wouldn't that be nice to go back today? You can't even make 5% on a CD these days. But, I don't know what it would have been like for people who were working full-time at a full salary at that time. I would imagine their bonuses were very wonderful. But even for me, just a lowly part-time college teller, they had a very substantial bonus. I won't tell you how much it was, but I will tell you it was thousands of dollars that we would receive at the end of every year. And as you might imagine, if you are lucky enough to be one of those who secures this kind of position, especially as a young person, this is not something you're very readily going to give up. Perks like that do not come along very often for people at that age and that kind of work experience. So I valued my job a lot. I worked hard at my job, and I worked to excel at my job. However, after I had been there for a little while, and of course experienced the fruits of this bonus system a couple of times, a moral dilemma began to develop me. And that dilemma was this. I began to realize where that bonus money came from and why they gave us such a good bonus. The branch that I happened to work at happened to be the branch that took care of overdraft protection for the whole bank. And overdrafts, of course, are the income that you make off of a bounced check. But it's also the income that you can make off of debit card purchases if a person overdraws their account with their debit card. Well, at first I didn't really think anything about that. But then, when I began to learn that actually our whole bonus system was dependent upon how much money that we brought in for overdrafts during the year, I began to think to myself, is this okay? Because more or less, I figured we are profiting off of the irresponsibility or the weaknesses of other people. Now, what bothered me wasn't so much the fact that we charge for overdrafts. To me, that was a perfectly legitimate thing. A person writes a hot check and bounces it. Well, we certainly want to charge them a fee because we're trying to discourage them not to do that. The bank does not want you to do that. What did trouble me, however, at least initially, was how this worked off of the debit card system, though. Because as banks would extend you overdraft protection, that meant not only would it cover a bad check, but if you were out using your debit card, it would also cover any purchases that you made beyond money that you had in your account, at least to a certain extent. Well, on the one hand, that sort of thing can be a real lifesaver. I remember one time a guy calling in. It was fairly late in the evening, and he had called in. He had been out traveling, and he was on his way home, and he had got stuck somewhere, and he needed to buy gas. Well, he had not taken any cash with him. All he had was his debit card, and he had not paid attention to how much money he had in his account before he left, and he ran out while he was on his trip. And he was there trying to get gas at the gas station, and it wouldn't give him any gas, and he was absolutely stuck. Now, if he had had overdraft protection on his account, he could have used his debit card. I mean, sure, it would have charged him $20-something at the time in order to do that, but it would have been a perfectly legitimate thing, and he could have paid that back when he got back. However, because of the branch that I was working at the time, and the particular clientele that was served by our branch, I saw another side of the issue. Many people, I learned, do not reconcile their bank accounts. Many people do not pay attention to how much money they have in their account, do not pay attention to where their account is at. So more or less, they use their debit card as a fail-safe. And they figure if their debit card worked, that meant they had money. And if their debit card didn't work, that meant they didn't have money. Well, that works unless you have overdraft protection. And what would happen is people would use it. They would get behind in their account. They would rack up all of these fees. And then, of course, when their next paycheck came in, it would pay back all of that up. But now they're starting out the month behind. And you see how this begins a cycle that goes over and over and over again. And so it was this aspect of it that really began to weigh on my conscience. I thought, is this legitimate? Are we intending for this to happen? Are we trapping people by doing this? Because the truth was, a lot of people simply didn't know how the process worked. And for several years, back and forth, not all the time, you understand, I wasn't thinking about it all the time, but for several years, I really wrestled with this question. But on the other hand, you also understand I had this very powerful motivation. This was thousands of dollars in my pocket every year. How am I going to make this decision? Well, ultimately, for reasons that I will not take time to go into this morning, I did wrestle with it. And I did finally come to peace with the fact that even though this happens, that we weren't intending for that to happen. I knew the people who ran the bank, who were running the bank. I didn't think it was their intention to trap people in that way. It was just something that happened because of the way things are set up. But even though I didn't ultimately decide to either quit the bank or to reject the bonus, I did decide on the positive side that I had an absolute responsibility to my customers. And as a frontline person, my responsibility was this. Every person that I opened for an account for, I had to tell them, this is how this works. Be careful how you use it. For every person that I talked to about their checking account, I had to tell them, this is how this works. Use it well, but be careful with how you use it. And that story sticks out to me because it was one of the first times, and maybe one of the only times in my working experience, where I felt this tension between a personal benefit versus a public responsibility. But if I'm not mistaken, in your job, whatever it may be, you also may see that those same kind of tensions develop. And so the question becomes, how do we navigate those choices? How do we navigate the choices between what benefits us as individuals and what benefits those that we serve through our work? In my opinion, the story of Esther really helps us to think through some of these kinds of decisions. Now, Esther, of course, is not really a story about work, but actually, if you use your imagination a little bit, it kind of is a story about work. It is about a woman who becomes queen of Susa, and in a very real sense, there are few jobs that are more important and more influential than being the queen. We see this play out actually early in the chapters of the letter that we did not read here this morning. Before Esther ever comes on the scene or the Jewish people rise as a part of the storyline of this whole event, you see how the queen, the first queen, plays into the story, and it actually gives rise to this whole occasion. King Xerxes was throwing this great big party. For 6 months, he had been showing off his wealth, showing off his power. Anybody who wanted to come to see how great his kingdom was welcome to come and see it. And now at the end of this 6-month period, they were having a big party. I mean, a big party. For 7 whole days they were partying, eating and feasting and drinking. But while the king was throwing this great party, the queen was also fulfilling a very essential role. While all the men were in there with the king and they were eating and drinking and having a good time, what about all the women? Well, the queen took care of that. She served and took care of all of the women who were there. However, on the last day of the feast, as the king was full of wine and good spirits, he got a very harebrained idea. He decided that he was going to invite his wife, Queen Vashti, to come in with the boys. You see, Vashti was very lovely, very beautiful woman. And so he invites her. He says, "Come and wear your crown while you're at it." Now, when you first read that, it seems sort of innocent enough. Okay, maybe the king wants to show off his wife. Well, we all like to show off our pretty wives and that sort of thing. We understand that. But no, you have to read it with a little bit of orneriness in the story to really see what's happening. It's not that he just invites her to come wearing the crown. He invites her to come wearing only the crown, you see. Vashti is a team player, but she's got self-respect. And this is one request she's not going to fulfill. And she tells the king, "Forget about it, I'm not coming." King's irritated about this. He calls together all of his wise men. He says, "What are we going to do about this? The wife just told me off." And they say, "Well, that's unacceptable. If you let her get away with this, all the women in the kingdom will think they can tell off their husbands and get away with it." And the king said, "You know, you're right." And so they said, "You have to banish her." And he said, "Okay, I will." And he does. Well, as you might imagine, this creates a very important job opening. Applications are now being taken for the new queen. Only this is not going to be open enrollment. The king is going to send his servants throughout the land, and he's going to find the most beautiful women, and he's going to find all of them must be virgins, of course, and he's going to choose them, and he's now going to bring them so that he can choose his new queen. Turns out this is a very elaborate process. Before any of these women can come before the king, they have to go through a year of beauty treatments. For 6 months, they must get oiled up and all this kind of stuff in order to soften their skin. And then for another 6 months, they have all these perfume treatments and all this kind of stuff. Only the best, of course, to come before the king. And as the story unfolds, we learn for the first time that among what must have been a multitude of women who were brought to him is this young Jewish girl named Esther. Esther, of course, was raised by a cousin, Mordecai. Her parents were probably killed as they were at the capture of Jerusalem and they were brought into Babylonian captivity. Mordecai keeps a very close watch on Esther. Turns out, she becomes one of the favored ones. And in fact, she is chosen to be the new queen. Now, at this point in our story, it's worthy to pause over this and reflect on this for a moment. Imagine the luck of this young girl who lands this outstanding position. First of all, she's a Jew. She's a minority there in a foreign capital. Secondly, she's poor. She has nothing to bring to the relationship except for her beauty. But now, through a series of events that no doubt she could hardly believe, she has found herself the queen. The queen. This means she has status. She has influence. She now has a measure of wealth, or at least access to wealth that she has never had before. And she now has a sense of security that she never otherwise would have had. Sometimes, though not in all cases, but sometimes, our jobs can provide this sort of thing for us. It can provide a certain amount of status. It can provide a sense of security, and it gives us a sense of stability against the unknowns of life. Work can be a great blessing to us as individuals. Certainly the case for Queen Esther. She has found herself in a wonderful, wonderful job. However, circumstances are not going to stay rosy forever. Through a series of events that I won't take time to illustrate, to narrate for you here this morning, Esther's cousin Mordecai draws the ire of one of the king's officials, Haman. He gets him so upset that he wants to have Mordecai killed, but that's not going to be good enough. He's so angry that Mordecai will not bow down to him as one of the powerful men of the nation. He's not just going to kill Mordecai, he's going to kill all the Jews. Now, up until this point, remember, Esther has not revealed her identity. The king does not know that she is a Jew. Apparently, Mordecai had instructed her, never reveal your identity. But now, things have changed. Mordecai, her adopted father, sends word to her, and he says, listen, you have to do something about this. You have to go to the king and tell him what is happening in his palace. And at first that seems like an innocent request. Of course she has to do this. But then you learn this is actually a very dangerous thing to do. Because you see, in Susa, you don't just approach the king. You can do it. You can go to the king. But when you do, he has the right to decide your life or your death. If he's in foul humor and you go in to see him, dead like that. But if he's in a good mood and he extends the scepter your way, he'll let you live. And she asked Mordecai, do you understand the risk that I would be taking? The danger that I would be putting myself in? I want you to think for a moment about the choice that lays before Esther. I mean, she had such great luck, didn't she? She's landed this position that who would have ever dreamed as a little girl she would have landed? She has wealth and status and power and security and luxury. She has everything that someone could want. But now, through circumstances that she could not control, her position is forced to make a choice. Will she use her position only to indulge the wonderful thing this does for her as an individual? Or will she use her position to serve her people? Notice how Mordecai approaches her as he sends word back in chapter 4 and verse 13. He says, don't think that because you have this nice position that your life will be spared, that you'll be any different from the rest of us. However, he says, who knows? But maybe you weren't put here for just such a time as this. And so Mordecai plants this idea in Esther's head. As great as all of this is for you as an individual, what if you weren't put there for you? What if you weren't put into that very occasion so that you might help your people? What Mordecai is appealing to, more or less, without stating it as such, is the idea of grace. He says to her, you didn't obtain this position for yourself. You're not responsible for the beauty that was given to you or for the circumstances that brought you to the royal palace. What if the reason you were brought there was something greater than your individual fulfillment? And as we think about Mordecai's statement to Esther, we can think about our own positions in life and how they might have a similar purpose. Our jobs, our work, can be a great means of personal fulfillment. But if that fulfillment, what our jobs do for us as individuals, is all that we focus on, we've missed part of the point. Part of the function of work is not just for what it does for us. Part of the function of work is service. Now, does it serve us? Certainly it does. But it should also serve others. Well, if we had time this morning, we would go on and we would complete the story of Esther. We would see that indeed she does take the risk, and it ends in a happy way. Because she takes the risk, she saves her people. But that's not so much what I want you and I to focus on this morning. That's a great and wonderful ending of the story. They don't all end that way, but isn't it wonderful that this one ended this way? But what I do want us to focus on is this tension that most of us experience to one degree or another in our working lives. And that tension is between what our work does for us and what our work does as service to others. And what I want to say to you today primarily is this: we all are recipients of God's grace. All the individual talents and abilities that we have been given, while of course in some measure is up to us to foster and build on those talents, the fact is we don't have anything that we haven't been given. And this starts from our very lives ourselves and goes all the way up to all of the talents and abilities that we might have. For some of us, we are going to have wonderful talents and abilities. And those talents and abilities are going to lead us to very good and wonderful things, to fruitfulness and productivity, maybe even to a measure of wealth and success. For others of us, it will not have such a profound effect. And to a certain degree, we don't often have a lot of choice in that. Circumstances dictates that. However, no matter where God's grace may lead us, we do have this balance to maintain. What work does for us as individuals, what work does as service to others. Is work a part of our individual fulfillment? Yes, it is. Absolutely. I want to say it again. Yes, it is. And we have seen what has happened in societies where work is taken out of the individual realm. Oli and I were talking about this the other day. She was telling me about how in Russia men are often perceived as drunks. And I said, why is that? Why is it often that way? And she says, well, because communism crushed men. Men have a sense of need for competition, a sense of fulfilling something, of doing something. And when you're only working for the good of the whole and not also as a part of individual fulfillment, that crushes men. What do? Well, then they drink. What else do you do? So you don't want to be idealistic about that. However, the opposite is also true. Work is not just a means of personal fulfillment. It is also a way that we serve one another. You see, Esther, she had wonderful personal fulfillment in her job. I must know it must have been a wonderful thing. But there was a moment where she was asked, will you put the service of others on the same level that you put the service to yourself? And in that instance, she said yes. Now, most of us will never face a choice so stark. Thank God. But it is to say, the little decisions matter. So over the last several weeks, we have been exploring the darker side of this thing called work. Next week, as we begin to move into the final section of our series of lessons, we'll begin to paint a renewed vision of work. We looked at the dark side now. Now we'll begin to get a renewed vision. What does work look like in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ? That's what we'll begin to talk about next week. Hope you'll be here. Let's stand and sing.